Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 5th edition of our online policy dialogues following the US elections. My name is Iana Maisuradze, and I'm the Junior Policy Analyst of the Europe in the World program here at the European Policy Center. Thank you all for joining us today. Today's title is Liberal World Order after the US elections. What is next? Compared to the last 4 iterations, which were about the run-up to the US elections. Thank you again for joining us today, our panelists, which I will introduce in a second. But just a few words about what we will be discussing today. As you know, 2024 is the biggest electoral year in history, with over half of the global population called to cast their ballots. But everyone has been waiting for 5th of November for quite some time, and this will have effects on domestic and international trends all over the world. Trump 2.0, the result of the US election, it will definitely affect the future of liberal democracy, which is also the topic of our discussion, and its institutions, as well as it may redefine transatlantic relations and our security environment in fundamental ways. Today, in this online policy dialogue, we will also address the domestic and international trends that are expected now post-US elections. We will focus on Trump 2.0 and what it holds for us, also on the European side. We will also explore which US policies might change or remain, and the future of the US in the European security, as well as how Trump 2.0 will affect transatlantic relations. We have an excellent panel to discuss these issues today. And let me introduce them to you. Francis Burwell, Distinguished Fellow at the Europe Center of the Atlantic Council, as well as the Senior Director at the McLarty Associates. We have Kremidas-Courtney, Senior Visiting Fellow at the European Policy Center. We have Ambassador João Vale de Almeida, EPC Senior Advisor and Visiting Fellow at the Cambridge University. And last but not least, we have Georgina Wright back with us, recent Senior Fellow and Deputy Director for International Studies at Institut Montaigne. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Before I pass the floor to our first speaker, let me give some housekeeping rules. Our session today will last for 75 minutes, slightly longer than before. We have a lot of ground to cover today. I will start with a few opening questions to the speakers, and then we will engage in a conversation. Afterwards, I will open the digital floor to the audience for a question and answer session, and then we will wrap it up. You can ask questions in the chat and also raise your hand, and I will ask my colleagues to bring you in. I would like to kindly ask you to please keep your questions or comments short, also in the chat, so that I can read them at a glance. So without further ado, let me turn to our panelists, and let me start with Francis, as she's based in the US. If you could just give us an overview of what is happening and how this will affect the US foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for including me on this panel, and it's great to be back with João and Georgina and Chris. Excellent to have you join as well. I think that the obvious conclusion is that this was a pretty solid victory for Trump and his supporters. We saw not a landslide, I would not put it that way, but I would say that there were significant shifts in key demographics that were unanticipated by the Harris campaign. And in particular, a stronger support for Trump among young men, Hispanics in particular. And I think that we have, with this presidential election, seen the emergence of Hispanics as a more critical voting bloc than they have ever been in the past. But I would also point out that, in a way, it was a very normal election because the public is really concerned about inflation. And Harris was unable to differentiate herself from being an incumbent. She was really caught, as they say, between a rock and a hard place. How are you loyal to your president? Because you're still the vice president, right? But are not an incumbent. And that's really an impossible thing to, an impossible hand. So a key thing was inflation. There's just no doubt about that. And I won't say the power of incumbency, but actually the danger of being the incumbent in this particular economic climate. But I also think that we should be aware of some other things. And one was, for me in particular, there was a very strong gender divide. Even though women were not, they didn't vote overwhelmingly for Harris, but it was enough to say that men see the country and its future differently than many women. The other thing is that the two campaigns had different social media strategies. And I think in particular, the Republicans, I've heard those who are far more expert than me on this, remark at how successful they were in getting Trump into the non-regular media, kind of manosphere, podcasts, ecosphere. And that's something that was also, I don't want to say aided, but amplified by foreign interference in this election. And I think that's something that both Europe and the United States are going to have to deal with. We saw, for example, in a very concrete way, Russian trolls calling in bomb threats to Georgia voting facilities, and they had to extend their hours. But that's not even, I mean, we had a lot of fake stuff on social media, and a lot of it was foreign generated and then amplified by Americans. So I think that's something that we really need to deal with. What I think this means is that this election was not run on foreign policy, right? But I think it has brought to the fore a coalition that says, we don't really care about our long-term alignments, and that the Harris campaign's efforts to stress the United States' role in the world, its support for Ukraine, its support for alliances, just landed with a thud. And I think, you know, for years, those of us in the transatlantic business have talked about the successor generation that's going to move away from the Atlantic. And for years, it has not arisen. But here, I am concerned that we now are at that point where key demographics in this country, perhaps if the economy is better, they will take a different view, or if they feel the economy is better, because our economy is not bad overall. I think that there is a real question about the United States leadership in the world. And I think we're coming to an administration that will be domestically focused and will pursue in foreign policy kind of a politics of grievance. Everyone is taking advantage of us. That's the message that's sold.
Thank you, Fran, for this overview, and we will definitely come back to you to explore more of what will change in the U.S. foreign policy. But let me turn to Chris now for his take on what happened in the U.S. Domestically, and also if you can add a few words about the foreign policy, but we will definitely delve deeper into how the U.S. Foreign policy change will affect the EU and the other parts of the liberal world. Chris.
Thank you, Iana. Thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure to join you this afternoon. Fran covered a lot and covered it well, as usual. And I have to say I agree with most all of it. What I'll do is try to fill in some of the gaps and some other things that Fran didn't have time to get to. I think I agree this was not a landslide election. An electoral college landslide does not equal a popular vote landslide. Looking at the numbers, this was more of a 50 to 48 win for Trump in the popular vote. If you look at the comparison to 2020, he gained about 324,000 votes over his totals from 4 years ago. And Kamala Harris received about 10.4 million fewer votes than Biden did. So there's definitely a delta there. There's a lack of enthusiasm on the Democrats' part. Could be driven by the Biden administration's support for Israel. I know a lot of Democrats that I've talked to on an anecdotal basis said they just can't support the administration because of Gaza. So I think there's a Gaza element there. How big is it? How small is it? We don't know yet. It's definitely there. I think also Vice President Harris focused on democracy and abortion, women's rights. She had 107 short days to formulate a campaign, and this was her approach. And in the end, 52% of white women voted for Trump. So I think, as Fran covered so well, there's definitely a gender gap. But in 2016, Mr. Trump won white women at 54%. So he only lost 2% of white women in that time. With black women and others, I mean, obviously he didn't do as well. And especially for young men, in particular, young Latino men, I think it's very important for everyone to realize that the Latino population in the United States is not a monolith, not by a long stretch. They're very segmented. And I think the Trump campaign found a way to split the Latino vote very well, despite his rhetoric. I think also immigration, they really pounded away on immigration in a lot of the ads. I kind of tortured myself watching the ads in the United States on some of these things. And I think also in gender overall, you had this split between sort of the Harris campaign talking about women's rights, women's reproductive rights, women's women's agency, which obviously energized a lot of women. If you look in Iowa, women over 65 really swung a good ways. Obviously not enough, but it was multi-generational. And then you had young men sort of feeling left out. Fewer men go to college now in the United States. Fewer young men graduate from college. They're not doing as well in school. They're not, obviously not doing as well economically afterward. A lot of the unskilled and semi-skilled labor jobs that they would go into, do they not go to college, don't pay as well, and there are fewer of them. And they compete with a lot of immigrant labor. So, I mean, obviously for young men, that's a factor. And I think Democrats are finding that they're still failing to reach the working class. They don't really have the same purchase with the working class that they did before. There are still a lot of people in the United States who feel left behind by globalization. And as successful as the Inflation Reduction Act was in sort of reindustrializing the United States, with a lot of money earmarked for rural counties, a lot of these red Trump counties received a lot of that funding, but it didn't translate into giving credit to the administration. Now, I don't think Vice President Harris did enough to take credit for it, but also what a lot of pollsters have found is that people who get a higher paying job or they get a pay raise, they attribute that to their own hard work and not by anything coming from the government. I think one thing that's worth mentioning also is this was the cryptocurrency election. Crypto interests were the #1 donors across the board, and we now have crypto interests who will be placed in places like Treasury and the Securities and Exchange Commission to I think we're going to find ourselves very soon with some decisions that will make cryptocurrency a more formal part of our financial system. And that obviously has a lot of implications we could talk about in the Q&A. But I think overall, my big questions are, Trump's inner circle obviously filled with a number of anti-Ukraine and pro-Putin advisors. My big question in seeing how this administration comes together is how many conventional Republicans will be appointed and what will their influence be? And we don't know. We see Senator Marco Rubio being mentioned for Sec State. Is he still a conventional Republican? I think so. We'll see. But who else gets in some of these key jobs and how much influence will they have? Obviously, there's a lot to cover in a very short amount of time, but I'll leave it there and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for your insights about the domestic angle of the US elections. So we will continue talking about its effects on and spillovers on foreign policy later on. But let me turn now to Ambassador Vale de Almeida about his views on how the US foreign policy will be changed and what will remain of the current foreign policy and how will it affect the European side. What are the European perceptions? Thank you.
Good. Good to see you all from across the pond and within several places in Europe. Let me give you a few comments of which for me are kind of a matter of fact. And the first one is that this was a good day for American democracy. People were saying that it was, rotten or rigged or not working or ineffective. Well, in fact, people expressed their views, and they chose a president. They chose a Congress. They chose senators and congressmen and congresswomen. And I think today's lunch at the White House, where President Biden hosts President-elect Trump, which did not happen 4 years ago, by the way, because Mr. Trump didn't find it appropriate. This is a good illustration of democracy working. And I think one of the first important elements of these elections is what kind of message does it project into the world? I think there is a first positive message, which is to say democracy works and democracy accommodates people's will. My second point is that this is a big victory for Donald Trump. No doubts about that, undeniable. A third time he got back after a defeat in his second attempt. He won all swing states. He won the popular vote. Most likely he will have control of the two houses. And of course, he already has the control of the Supreme Court. So this is a huge political victory. I would say this political phenomenon is maybe one of the most important, if not the most important one in the first quarter of this century, and we should recognize that. Thirdly, I think this is an even bigger defeat for Kamala Harris. And people are saying, and I think it's fair to say that this was more an Harris defeat than a Trump victory. I still think it's a big victory for Trump, but it's also a very big defeat for Harris. She did worse than Biden and Hillary. She lost basically the working class and a big chunk of the Hispanic vote, even on the black vote as well. I'm not sure I totally agree with Fran about the women's vote, because I've seen evidence of white women, Hispanic women, going for Trump and being able to separate abortion from the choice of a president. In a number of states, people were able to vote on an abortion kind of referenda, and they voted in favor of a more liberal approach to abortion while voting for Trump at the same time. So I think we need to go deeper into that to see the extent to which there was a real gender gap. And three other points that for me are also, from my point of view, a matter of fact. This was a big defeat for decency in politics. Democracy works, but it can work in a more decent or less decent way. I think this was a big defeat for decency in politics. I think this was a big victory for populism, and this will have an impact elsewhere, and particularly in Europe. And this was a big defeat for the woke culture. I think people need to recognize that, need to reflect upon that, and take draw conclusions from it. Regarding Europe, the way I see Europe's reaction today, and we can discuss that further down the road, I will use 4 words: anxiety, surprise, nervousness, and division. And we'll see where that will take us.
Thank you, Ambassador, for such a concise overview of what is happening right now, not only in the US, but also in the EU, in only 4 words. So let me turn to Georgina now to assess the transatlantic perspective. What should we expect in terms of transatlantic alliance, transatlantic bond? How should we proceed? Thank you.
Thank you, Iana, and thank you to EPC for inviting me back. It's really nice to see some friends and colleagues on this call. What can we expect? I think we should expect the unexpected, and we should totally not expect to know what's going to happen over the next 4 years. I think that is a key lesson from Trump 1, although there will be very big differences from Trump 1 too, which we can perhaps come back to in the Q&A. I mean, I think for Europe, I've said this before, The real question for Europe is how do we react to a United States that, you know, doesn't just treat us as an ally, but sees us as a competitor and frankly, sometimes a nuisance. And I think that question we haven't really answered. We've said on these calls before that Biden was realistically going to be the last transatlantic president we have of the United States. Here we have a president who has promised to deliver an agenda for all Americans, but actually when you look into the detail of what he said, it really is an agenda primarily for his own voters. And that will have two big implications for Europe, partly on security and on the economy. On security, you know, we have a president who does not want the United States to be in endless wars. He wants to stop wars as soon as possible. For Ukraine, that has obviously huge implications. J.D. Vance's vice president has made clear what a sort of potential peace settlement could look like for Ukraine. And that means basically accepting that Russia will keep hold of the territory that it has conquered, to have a demilitarized zone, and then provide Ukraine with weapons to be able to defend itself in the future. Now, I think Trump's appointment of his national security advisor in Waltz is quite an interesting choice, actually. If you look at his positions on Ukraine, he's been very supportive of US support, military and financial, to Ukraine, although he believes that Europeans should do much more. And that's why he voted against the last US aid package to Ukraine. And I think that says two things. That says that in Trump's entourage, people realize that actually what happens in Ukraine does matter to the United States. It has direct implications for the United States. And it also means that, you know, the US won't necessarily just abandon Ukraine or force a peace settlement on it. However, there will be a lot of work and groveling from the Europeans to show what we're already doing and what more we can be doing, because this is fundamental for Trump and for the US, I think, more generally. You know, the real kind of threat is not Ukraine and Russia's role in Ukraine, it is China. And I think here too, the Europeans are going to have to astutely demonstrate that there is a link between what happens in Europe and what's happening in China. For example, the presence of North Korean soldiers, you know, with next to Russian soldiers in Ukraine should show and be a sufficiently, I think, you know, evidence that there are linkages there. But I think Europeans are going to have to work much harder to show those, because ultimately Trump does not want the US to be involved in endless wars. And, you know, he has a lot of voters who've said to him, we don't want to spend money in Ukraine when we're struggling at home. So it's going to be a battle for us there. On the economy, I mean, if you have to sort of boil down what Trump thinks is, you know, US exports are good and US imports are bad. And so if you are a country that has a massive trade deficit with the United States, well, you're going to be on his bad list and you're going to have to prove what more you can buy, I think, from the United States. Now, that poses a problem for the EU because some countries have much you know, higher and more significant trade deficits with the United States than others. And, you know, João ended up on that and saying the division inside the EU. The EU member states have had, you know, a tradition of kind of each liking their bilateral relationship with Washington. And actually, they don't really want the EU representative or the EU ambassador, I'm looking at João here, to speak on their behalf. They quite like all the ambassadors to have a privileged relationship. And this becomes much more complicated when you're trying to have a strong EU position where you can communicate to the Trump administration what you're doing on defense, what you're doing on the economy, what more you could do. And I think it also brings the question of who our interlocutor is going to be. And I think you have names of Meloni floating around, for example. Trump really likes her. Elon Musk really likes her. And today, I think she met with Marco Rubio to discuss foreign policy. So will she become the prime interlocutor with Washington? I have doubts that von der Leyen will be able to play that role like she did during the Biden administration. Trump has no care in the world for the EU institutions. And so I think there's real kind of significant thinking that has to take place on what the offer is to the Trump administration, but also how we do it. And so I'll end up by saying, you know, he is entirely unpredictable, but I think we need to really be seriously think about trade deficit, because he does look at that and see what more we can do to maybe rectify that. And then if we have clear foreign policy aims, how we make sure that the US remains involved, well, that's going to have to ask us to do more. And it's been, I think, quite interesting since Trump's victory, how lots of EU leaders have been saying, oh, well, actually, you know, he was right that we should be spending more on defense. I thought that was quite an interesting change in tone, but I shall end there.
Thank you so much, Georgina, and Mr. On the topics that you mentioned security and economy, and by security, let's stick with Ukraine. And you mentioned that that there will be a peace settlement. There are plans for peace settlement. President Trump himself has proposed to end the war within 24 hours. So what do you think will be the actual outcome of his attempts, and how will the EU react on this, by spending more, or how will the EU actually try to compel the US to stay on the same side to provide more of security guarantees?
Is that for me, Anna? Or for
yes,
okay.
and we can go around around the digital table with this question as well.
Okay, well, I've just been very long, so I will be very brief. I think the thing that we need to remember is Trump will only push this peace settlement if he thinks it will work. He doesn't want to look humiliated in front of Russia. And that's going to be an important consideration in how he approaches this. He hasn't really been clear on what this peace settlement looked like. The clarification has really come from J.D. Vance, but J.D. Vance is not the president, he's vice president. And also, I think that's why it's interesting to see how Marco Rubio, if he does become the next, State Department head, but also Waltz, his national security advisor, how they posit themselves on the Ukraine issue. I think they will try the negotiated settlement route. That poses uncomfortable questions for Europeans in that they just won't be around the table. It's going to be between Moscow, Kiev, Washington, possibly Beijing. But certainly if I think, some Europeans would like to try and push the US administration to not immediately go for a settlement, but actually try and continue to support Ukraine for at least another year. And the question then becomes, what more can Europeans do without the United States? So what weapons can we give? What financial support can we give? There were some very interesting comments made by Kallas yesterday in her hearing in front of the European Parliament. And I think there are in different capitals lots of ideas that are being put on the table, not least because there's a new German election, possibly a new German government, and the debt brake doesn't seem to be as fixed in stone as it could be before, which could provide more leverage in, sort of putting money aside for defense spending. So I think it's still, I've given you a waffly answer, but it depends a bit on what Trump decides to do.
Thank you, Georgina. Ambassador, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I think we need to be, very much aware of what is at stake here. I mean, let's be very frank. And, being a retired ambassador, I can be freer in the expression of my opinion. We need the US to sort out Putin's invasion of Ukraine in a decent way. It would be great if we could do it alone, but at least for the moment, we cannot do it alone. As far as the settlement of the peace negotiations or the peace deal, as far as reconstruction, as far as security guarantees, it's an illusion to think that the EU can do it alone. And it's important that we do a maximum to keep the United States on board. We have a new president, we have a new approach, and we need to engage with the new president and the new administration. It's still early days, but I don't think we have much time to lose. because we know that this transition period will be important. And we know that as soon as the team is being built up very, very quickly, and it will go through Congress very easily as well. So we need to be ready as soon as possible. Of course, the German elections, as Georgina pointed out, disturbs our calendar, of course, because one of our main components will be in transition. But still, I think Europe needs to focus. My advice would be engage, embrace, and be bold regarding Trump. I mean, we need to reach out and say, we want to work with you to find a solution. There is no point in antagonizing a president who has just been elected with an enormous landslide, who has total legitimacy to implement the program on which he was elected. So no need to provoke him unnecessarily, but to try to build bridges and try to find common ground, because again, we cannot do it alone. I think when I said that we are anxious, we are, because I think most leaders would have preferred Kamala Harris to win. We are anxious because there's a degree of unpredictability associated with Trump, and of course everyone is anxious about unpredictability. There was a degree of surprise because I think the traditional media commentators got it wrong. They didn't read the room, and everybody was caught by surprise. Nervousness because we don't know exactly how to deal with this. We had an experience of Trump 1, but we know and we expect Trump 2 to be more difficult to handle. And my last point was the vision, and I think we need to be very, very, serious about the situation. We don't have a common position for the moment, and we need to find it very, very quickly and as consensual as possible. The problem is that we are in transition at European Union level. We have a kind of transition in France. We have definitely a transition in Germany. We have 2 other countries who are relatively stable, Poland and Italy, that can play a role. And I agree with Georgina that Mrs. Maloney could play a role. I hope that Poland can play a role in a different way as well. So we need to pull all our strengths, bring them together, and particularly try to avoid or prevent people in the Trump administration from trying to divide us even further. And we know that our system is divisible, if I can say this in English. We've seen how Russia and China sometimes are able to divide us. We will have a third partner that is going to try to divide us on a number of points. So we need to resist all that. And my view is that we need to resist it by being engaged, by presenting a constructive agenda to Trump, things that on which we can work together and be as united as possible.
Thank you, Ambassador. Fran, would you like to add on this, please?
So I rarely disagree with João, but I want to put something out here on the table. The view, certainly among the Trump people in Washington, and a wider circle in Washington, of Europe, is that Europe is divided and weak, and that Europe cannot do anything on itself by itself of significance. And I think that if Europe wants to deal with this administration, it has to come across as confident of what it is going to do, and that it can do it. Maybe not always with the specifics. Trump's not big on specifics. But when Europeans, whether think tankers or officials, come over here and they say, oh, we're too divided, or we can't do it ourselves, even though it's existential for us, then Trump doesn't back losers. So I think that's something that Europe needs to think about very seriously, is it may be a presentational issue, because when I visit Europe, I don't hear doubt about the importance of Ukraine. Does Europe have challenges to meet it? Yes. But I was struck over the last couple of days of hearing about a possible realignment of cohesion funds to be used for military support. So not weapons and ammunition, but important things that happen in defense. I think it's a really big move to have a defense industry commissioner. But I also just think that as someone who's watched Europe for a long time, the amount of coherence that has developed in the face of what has happened in Ukraine is remarkable. And I think Europe should ride that horse and prove that it can do these things. I would thus underline the importance of the whole competitiveness debate in Europe. The number one thing I think that Europe can do vis-a-vis the Trump administration is to make clear that it is going to pursue its own interests, not in a combative way, but it is going to pursue its own interests, and it is going to be an economy in the future that the United States must respect. And so I think that that is key to this. On the Washington politics of it, there have been numerous people who are going into this administration who once supported Ukraine, whose support has faltered, at least in public. I do think that some of them can be won back over. I'm not sure about Marco Rubio, but the number one issue they will have is that they will be judged by their loyalty to Donald Trump. On a big issue like Ukraine, it will be Trump in the end who makes the decision. Now, there is an argument to be made that Europe is spending a lot of money on US defense products. All of our defense companies are making money hand over fist through Europe. And it's going to be a long time before Europe has its own defense industry and moves that production from the United States to the EU. So I would say there is a strategy here, or a deal that can be made. Number one, NATO. Trump pushed everyone to spend more. And while he was gone, everyone got really serious about it. And now here is the result. And so I think there's a story there. And I've noticed a lot of willingness, I'm not sure that's the right word, but tolerance among European leaders to let Donald Trump take credit for this. I think that will be something that will cause NATO to be seen in a more positive light in the Trump White House than it was in the last administration, because it's a success story for Trump. But I also think that the real priorities for Trump will be China and tariffs, things that directly affect the US economy. So I think Ukraine, there may be some time, maybe not, to start moving the United States, the Trump administration, to at least be less confusing about it. And I mean, no one here is talking about American boots on the ground, right? So I think that there is an avenue there. We'll have to see, because Trump does like his deals. So it's up to the Europeans to put a better deal on the table than one that Vladimir Putin can put on the table.
Thank you, Fran, for your insights and also sharing your perspective of how this should be dealt with. Chris, would you like to come in?
Yes, just very quickly. A great discussion. I think, and I'm going to pick up where Francis left off, and I think that is, you know, from the 1980s, from his earliest days, Trump always saw himself as a deal maker. That's his, you know, I'm a deal maker. That's a big part of his identity. And I think what's most important is that the deal that he makes a deal with Europe and not with Moscow. Make a deal with Europe and Ukraine, not Moscow. So how can we show strength? I agree with a lot of your observations. You know, I live here in Europe. I've been in Europe for a long time. I see a Europe awakened. I see a Europe that has more resolve. I see a Europe with more cohesion. I see a Europe that, if it plays its cards right, could make Mr. Putin regret unifying Europe in this way, in the same way that his actions caused Sweden and Finland to decide to join NATO. But I think if if Europe can and should come from a position of strength, let's not forget, and perhaps we need to remind the Trump administration and some of their new officials that Europe is the United States' #1 investor of foreign direct investment and vice versa. So, if they don't want all those American institutional investors' investments in Europe to be in danger or to lose value, then we need to work together. But I think coming from a position of strength, work with him to make the deal with Europe and not with Moscow, I think is critical. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Let me just now move on to one more security question, which was actually raised by Francis, the role of the US at NATO. Indeed, the member states have increased their spending within the alliance thanks to the push from President Trump's previous presidency. And what should we expect now? I mean, Trump has called NATO obsolete before. So what will be his strategy to make sure that the European side of the alliance is also as committed as the US? Fran, let's start from you.
Well, I think that the European side of the alliance needs to be united. I do think that Mark Rutte was a very good choice. He has experience with Trump, and I think that he's someone who can tell truth to power, but do it in a way that does not totally disrupt the relationship. I also think that the EU, in a way, needs to be willing to say that NATO has the lead on some things. I think let's find a way to not have this discussion about whether the EU moves on defense are in support of or not in support of NATO's troop planning. So I think that, NATO has a role, the EU has a role that is about the defense market and creating capacity. And I think that there needs to be a clear understanding between Rutte and von der Leyen, more than there was with Stoltenberg, about where this line is, who does what, so that it looks unified. And then I think there needs to be tolerance. There will be further pushing. The polls are at something like 4 or 5% defense spending now, and they will be held up as the good student. And so the others should be ready. I am concerned about the length of the transition in Germany. Pre-election, this is a long time for a snap election, but also coalition negotiations afterwards. And I think it's important that the biggest country in Europe and the one with the most potential to increase its defense spending with impact gets its government in order quickly.
Thank you. Ambassador, would you like to add your thoughts about NATO?
Yeah, I think we have a large degree of agreement, even between me and Fran. I think we all agree that this should be a wake-up call for Europe. Maybe the difference is I think that the wake-up call would take a little longer than Fran or Chris expected to last. But I hope I'm wrong. But as I said earlier, I'm worried by not necessarily by the institutions in Brussels. There's only that much that institutions can do if member states are not ready to do. And I'm worried by the situation in two key countries in Europe, and that is Germany and France, for the reasons that we know very well. And I'm worried by the capacity of Washington to introduce elements of division in our system. So a wake-up call, yes. Hopefully people will wake up very, very soon, but maybe it will take a little bit longer than we want. In the meantime, and that's my main point, in the meantime, we need to try to engage as much as we can with the Trump administration, prevent them from doing too much too soon. That is not in our interest. Certainly invest in NATO, invest in our own capacity, to develop a defense industry, to create a defense market in Europe, to improve our effectiveness, and that's what we should do. So I'm relatively optimistic, but most of all, I'm realistic about what we can do. And one condition is clearly necessary, is that we have a clear vision of what we want to do. And this is not yet there. Let's be very frank. In Europe, we are not yet there, and we need to work on it. The transition conditions are not the best ones for us to do that, but let's hope we can be as fast as the Trump administration pretends to be, and that we can find the two of us somewhere in the middle of this process, having a good understanding of what we can do. Otherwise, it will be all for Mr. Putin, and I don't think we want that.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have mentioned how Trump presidency will shift more towards China rather than Russia as the prime enemy, so to say, quote unquote. We have also mentioned tariffs and also a more economic side that will affect not only domestic but also the cooperation with the European side during under Trump presidency. What else do you expect to change within the U.S. Domestic policy that will have a spillover on its foreign policy objectives and foreign policy for foreign relations? Chris, would you like to go ahead with this?
Certainly, thank you. I wasn't sure who that one was for. I think a few things here. First, I'll come back to the crypto issue, and I think it's important because we're talking about the global financial system. We've seen the instability. When we saw the FTX collapse in 2022, we saw the potential impact of unregulated cryptocurrencies having such an impact on our financial system. And now that we have with Mr. Musk and Peter Thiel and some of the other, so when I look at some of the names that are being considered for Treasury, for the Securities and Exchange Commission, and some other key positions, I see a lot of pro-crypto or crypto promoters coming in. You look at the recent past of the Biden administration was, we have fraud cases against some of these crypto companies, and so I think in a lot of ways, to me, this election feels like Silicon Valley is eclipsing Wall Street when it comes to, which part of the U.S. financial muscle has more influence in Washington. And I think this is a very Silicon Valley, tech bro looking group of advisors, which is such a turn in my eyes because, 4 years ago, Mr. Trump was calling cryptocurrency a scam. So, quite a turn there. But I think that really concerns me because having that much of the global financial system outside the purview of government oversight or the ability to, for democratic institutions to have a say in monetary policy, I think that definitely has an impact not only on Europe, but on the world. And so that's a big concern. I think also what you have is right now you have already 10,000 of these decentralized autonomous organizations, which are sort of crypto states, which sort of have their own form of governance that are governed by blockchain and Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies that are sort of, they basically want to supplant governance and want to sort of create their own separate, digital states. And so I think it's a real threat to democratic governance because let's face it, these aren't democracies. These are sort of little feudal states that are inside of these DAOs and crypto states. So I think that of all the things that I've seen coming out of this election and some of these things that will begin with U.S. domestic policy when it comes to finances, that one concerns me the most because I think we really don't know yet what the impact, how far and wide that impact will go and how much of that will wash up on our shores here on the other side of the Atlantic.
Thank you, Chris. Francis?
Just a two-fingered intervention. I think that the emergence of Elon Musk as a political figure is interesting. We don't know how long it will last. These are a lot of men with big egos, so it may be a short romance. But the EU is currently going after X and investigating, and certainly X is not curtailing its the behavior that drew the investigation on the Digital Services Act. So I think, and there's also the Digital Markets Act, of course. So I think that unlike with the Biden administration, where there was some convergence between the United States and the EU on some areas of, shall we say, tech excess, that may not be the case with this administration, and we may have a scenario where the EU is investigating or even penalizing a major ally of Donald Trump. So just to put a pin in another area of potential conflict.
Thank you, Fran. Ambassador, would you like to?
Yeah, just a point there. I agree with Fran. On regulation, on tech regulation, and all that. We know we have a tension across the Atlantic. To be very bold, they have the innovation and the capacity to put things on the market, and we have the capacity to regulate. I wish that it was slightly different, the balance. The point been now with the Trump administration is that they will have a different approach to regulation. On the crypto point, I don't think I agree with our colleague. If I understand correctly, what the serious part of the crypto industry in America, what they want is specific regulation, and they are very supportive of MiCA, the European regulation on crypto. They would like to have more or less the same in the US and not crypto treated as traditional banking activity. So I have a slight divergence there. But on regulation overall, I think we'll have a big issue with companies like X and others, and this should be, I would say, carefully managed by Europe if we want to not having it as a big source of conflict with the Trump administration. So I think the way you handle it, the way you present it, the way you talk publicly about that and the action you take, this will have a political implication, like all the economic files. I mean, let's take tariffs. We need to be on a strong position, and I think we are, to tell Americans, if you do this, we will do that. I think we need to find, as I said earlier, common ground. We need to think of China, what we can do together regarding, non-acceptable forms of behavior by China. So there's a lot of, areas that are interlinked. And my point remains the fact that we should not do anything in an improvised way, in a way that does not calculate the impact on our relationship with the future administration. And we know, and I think we all agree on that this administration will be much more transactional. They want to make deals. Europe is not transactional by definition. That's not our, kind of culture. But I think we need to become more transactional. We need to be more. And I saw Ursula von der Leyen saying, we're ready to buy more gas from LNG from America. Let's see how we can put that in a balance of other offers from your side as well. So I think, this will be tough. This will be difficult. This is outside our comfort zone. It may be a wake-up call, but it requires a very clear-eyed approach from Europe.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we have slowly moved towards defining the key issues that will shape transatlantic relations in the next few years. And we have mentioned already a couple of irritants within this relationship, including the digital, including China, including how Ukraine will be approached by the US in the next few years. We have also mentioned economy and also how the tariffs will be set from the US side. What would be the main areas of cooperation and areas so that where the US and the EU can work together side by side, not as competitors, but as real allies, and with the bond that they have had in past. Georgina, would you like to pick up on this first? Thank you.
I mean, I think we'd need another hour to answer that question. And again, it depends slightly on what the new administration, what its priorities are, particularly in terms of foreign policy. And I think if Marco Rubio gets sort of confirmed as Trump's pick for the State Department, that's, you know, just looking at sort of his past interventions and the way he's voted in Congress, bearing in mind, of course, that, you know, President Trump will have a big say on things. I think China is going to be a big issue. There's lots of questions about how hawkish the Trump 2 administration would be, given Elon Musk has personal commercial interest in China and expanding his commercial activity. So how much will he want the US administration to kind of make it really, really difficult to trade with China? And also bearing in mind that during Trump 1 presidency, I think trade with China increased, actually. It's just that around critical sensitive technologies and of course any civilian kind of equipment that could be used for military use, there were lots of export controls around that. But nonetheless, I suspect we'll have a continuation of limiting exports of critical technologies to China. And I suspect the Trump administration will push even further to make sure that Europeans align with those export rules. I think there's something to be done around financial regulation. You know, we've talked about crypto, we've talked about lots of other things. But actually, I think some of the concerns are shared on both sides of the Atlantic, but it's slightly out of my comfort zone. I'm conscious of time, but I just wanted to bring in the UK in this, if I may, not as a sort of Brit, you know, EU watcher. But I do think that actually a Trump administration could be a good thing for the UK-EU relationship, and it could be a very bad thing for the UK-EU relationship, depending on what the US does. So if it starts to slap tariffs on imports, you know, on EU exports, but it has a more favourable deal towards the UK, that could create a friction in the sort of renewed entente between the UK and the EU. But similarly, I think the UK and the EU have a lot to work on in terms of European security, beefing up the European pillar of NATO. And actually, I think that the UK government has sort of made clear that it wants a better relationship with the EU, what it would like to change. I think there's an element of negotiation, but I'm not so clear that the EU has made clear what it would be ready to give the UK. And I think that's a necessary plus if we want to improve that relationship and make sure that, you know, the US irritant doesn't come and further pull us apart.
Thank you, Georgina. Let me move to Ambassador with the same question about the areas of cooperation. And before I do that, let me encourage our online audience, which has been so patient as we have this discussion, to put your questions in Q&A box. Thank you. Ambassador.
Now, I just want, you know, first 2 fingers on what Georgina has just said about the UK, and not a surprise coming from former ambassador in the UK. I think what I said about dividing Europe applies to UK as well. I mean, applies to the relationship between the UK and the EU. There will be people tempted in Washington, tempted to divide the UK from the EU and the EU from the UK. And I think we need to counter that, because I think we have fundamentally the same interests in terms of trade, in terms of you know, supporting Ukraine and fighting back on Putin, even in terms of China. So I think we should make an effort on both sides of the channel to prevent Americans from dividing us. And on a more positive note, I think there's a place for triangulation here, for triangular cooperation between Europe, UK, and the US. I'm a strong believer in that. It would have been easier with Kamala Harris, obviously, but I think there is ground there for us to bring the Trump administration into that. In terms of areas of interest, again, we need to see what their priorities are. What we know for sure is that China will be one, and it's not clear where Europe stands on China. Let me be, again, very bold and very frank. We have, and this is an area where we need to be very attentive, because imagine that the US goes very tough on China. There will be a diversion of trade. There will be an impact on Europe if there is a real trade war between the US and China, and there will be requests from Washington for us to align with them. And this is, the last thing Europe wants to have is to reply to a question of choosing between the US and China, because politically it is obvious, economically it is not that obvious, and different positions within our member states. So these are areas where I hope that we can work on regulation, in spite of the issues that I raised earlier. I think it will be shooting ourselves in the foot if the West is incapable of assuring some regulatory leadership on AI, for instance, or new technologies that are coming up. If we don't do it, China will take the lead. So I think this is the kind of conversation that one could have with the Trump administration in this particular area. On the area of energy, I mentioned LNG earlier, but I think there's more that we can think in terms of how do we operate in the market. And of course, I'm not hopeful on climate at all, but we should never give up. And I think my main message overall here is that we should not give up on America. Europe cannot give up on America. It will be tougher, it will be more difficult, but we have to keep on trying.
Thank you, Ambassador. Chris, your thoughts about the area of cooperation?
Thank you, Iana. Yeah, I think it came clear to me a few years ago, working with advising an NGO in the Silicon Valley area, who were very concerned about big tech, that they wanted to come to Brussels to talk about tech regulation and not Washington. And so I think João, is the ambassador, made some good point. There are still people in the United States who are partners who have the same values and desires that the people in this group, and I think a lot of us have, and that is for democracy, for the rule of law, for human rights, all of these things. And it was so poignant for me to deal with so many of these groups that wanted to come to Brussels because they said at least the EU was willing to regulate big tech. So there are people on the other side of the sea who are counting on people here in Europe to regulate big tech because Washington won't. And I think that's it's a powerful bit of responsibility on our shoulders here as a Greek American, that's a hope that we carry for them as well. They've carried our hopes, and we can carry theirs. And so I think that's something very important, that we need to stay strong on tech regulation, even if Mr. Musk has a position in the cabinet. We need to stand for our values. We need to protect our democracy. I think the other thing that one thing we really need here in Europe that we don't have when it comes to high technology is we still don't have a venture capital ecosystem that is fit for purpose, and it hamstrings us every time. I am constantly flying to San Francisco to deal with people in Silicon Valley, and on the airplane around me are all these young, brilliant Europeans who are taking their ideas there are things they want to patent, their projects, their programs, they're taking them there instead of working on them here because there isn't enough money or support. And the sooner we fix that, and I think that's something we can fix in a whole of Europe approach with the UK, with the EU, with, don't forget Switzerland, very high tech savvy, with, I think, a whole of Europe approach on tech development would be hugely helpful to us in the future, not only for our prosperity, but for our defense as well.
Thank you, Chris, for your insights. And let me move to Frances about her thoughts about the areas of cooperation, if you would like to add a few points.
I'll just chime in on a few points that were raised by the others. First, I'm glad that João raised the LNG issue, because I think there is an opportunity here for a repeat, if I can, of the Juncker-Trump deal. It wasn't a deal in the formal sense, but the United States did, Europe did promise to import more soybeans and LNG Trump was very pleased with the deal. And it alleviated pressure on the bilateral US-EU relationship for some time. In reality, LNG numbers did not start to shift, and that was due to Putin when it happened. But it's happening now, and I certainly sensed concerns in Europe about the recent Biden administration's suspension of licensing for new LNG projects, which we expect to have lifted on day 1 or 2 of the Trump administration. So there is an opportunity there to use LNG to speak to a sector of the American economy that is very close to Donald Trump's heart. And I think that that is something that can help set the relationship on a different, in a different place from the beginning than it would be if Europe's immediate reaction is to prepare for retaliation on tariffs. But I will caution that we have a deadline of March 31st. That's the date that the suspension of the current EU retaliatory tariffs on US tariffs on steel and aluminum expires. And whether Brussels will extend that suspension, to me, depends a lot on whether Trump actually announces tariffs on Europe, not China, but Europe, and whether he just announces it or whether he actually starts the procedure. Those are 2 different things. And so it's going to be tough. And just a couple words on the China issue. I think Europe is going to have to figure out how explicit it wants to be with China. A lot of times Europe puts restrictions on or takes measures that are aimed at non-market economies, generally speaking, or within the context of WTO rules, but has been reluctant to name China, even though those who watch closely understand exactly what's going on. We've seen some of that shift, and the last TTC declaration, there was more naming of China, definitely, than there had been in the first. And so maybe Europe is making that jump, but the Trump administration will not be as tolerant of those subtleties, I think, as Secretary Blinken and President Biden were. And finally, one of the places that the US and the EU kind of grew together was in the Trade and Technology Council. And this created relationships not only at the working level, but among the principals. And it served as a diffuser, if I can put it that way, of tensions. When the IRA was passed, it was a place where Europeans could vent and where there was enough familiarity between the principals that they could get on the phone and say frankly what they thought and start to figure out then what to do about, if not fixing what wasn't possible to be fixed, at least to find a way to accommodate each other's interests in this. And I'm not at all optimistic that we will have a TTC. We may have a China dialogue that existed before in the Trump administration, as did some other dialogues, including an energy dialogue. So I'll circle back and say that energy is one of the places that we can probably see some cooperation, at least until 2040 or so, when green overtakes LNG in the EU. So
thank you, Fran, and you have actually answered some of the questions in the Q&A box, so thanks for that. Let me just move to the question and answers and ask the one that we haven't touched upon yet at all, which is the following. What do you expect in terms of changes to the US foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific? More or less involvement in the Quad, future of AUKUS, stronger or looser ties with Japan, South Korea, etc. And if we can keep our answers brief in the interest of time. Thank you. Ambassador, would you like to take on this question?
Okay, I'll be short. I think this is an area in which I'm talking about Indo-Pacific, not only China. It has to do with China, but not only China, Indo-Pacific. I think this is clearly an area where we should cooperate more and better. And we did some progress with the Biden administration. We don't know exactly how the Trump administration will deal with this, but clearly this is an area in which Europeans, for instance, should be very clear to say, we are as interested as you are in stability in the Indo-Pacific. We are as interested as you are in keeping the trade lanes open. And we are, as you are, interested in non-military confrontation and respect for sovereignty in the South China Sea and beyond. So I think this is an area in which we should and could cooperate well. The extent to which they will be tougher on China, less tough on China, remains to be seen. I never seen Mr. Trump too attached to Taiwan, to be very frank, much less than President Biden. So there's still a question mark where he stands on all this. But overall, I think this is an area that will put on the list of items where we should cooperate more and better.
Thank you, Ambassador. And as we are approaching to the end of our policy dialogue, let me ask a round of the same question to all of you. If you can give one recommendation to the EU for the Trump presidency period, what would this be? Back to you, Ambassador.
So as I said earlier, engage, be united as possible, be bold in your offers, and be open to make deals, but be, strict on principles and values. Thank
you, Ambassador. Georgina?
I think have a plan. So you have to go to Washington with 3 things that you can offer them. I think that's exactly, you've got to treat it as a business deal, as the art of the deal, as Donald Trump likes to call it. I think that will be absolutely key. But the question, and I think it's been touched upon by everyone on this call, has been the risk really of division inside the EU. To agree on those 3 offers is going to be extremely challenging, particularly given, as João said, France and Germany are much more weakened than they were during the Trump 1 presidency.
Thank you, Georgina. Over to you, Chris.
I think unite, engage from a position of strength, and be ready to make deals. We can't not work with the United States. We can't not trade with the United States. And I also think, one little footnote at the end, I think we need to look at the dynamics of what drove this election, things like inflation feeding populism. We need to shore up democracy here as well, so we don't have similar results in the future.
Thank you, Chris. Francis, floor is yours.
Be ready to, not be ready, go forward and put a deal on the table with several components. But at the same time, pursue Europe's own interests. Figure out what those are and pursue those and develop what you need to in your economy and defense industrial base to pursue and protect those own interests, not so much against the United States, but because that's the way that the Trump administration will respect you and see you as a viable partner.
Thank you, Francis. So explore, plan, engage, and go forward, to put it in one sentence. Thank you so much for being part of this discussion, for your insights, for your thoughts, for your analysis, and for staying with us for the last hour and 15 minutes. We are approaching the end of our online policy dialogue. We have scratched the surface of the discussion, and we have tried to analyze it shortly and concisely, but we have covered quite a lot of ground, and we have also discussed the future of liberal democracy to some extent, as well as its institutions. We have discussed how the transatlantic relations will be redefined in the next couple of years, and how Trump presidency will affect these relations. We have also discussed the domestic and international trends that we're expecting, as well as we have explored what policies may change or remain in the US. We have also briefly touched upon how the security environment will change with Trump's presidency within the NATO alliance, and what should the transatlantic relations and transatlantic partners see as the main areas of cooperation, as well as the irritants. I thank you once again very much for being with us, for your analysis and thoughts. I thank our audience for being patient and also for putting the questions in the Q&A box and for being engaged. EPC continues to work on the transatlantic relations, on the analysis of the US elections, and I wish you a nice afternoon, nice evening, and stay tuned for more from EPC about transatlantic relations.